This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today we're in Denmark, where amid a spate of suspicious drone incursions, young women face being called up for compulsory national service. The Dominican Republic is taking a hard line on illegal immigration. We meet the Haitians hiding in the hills to avoid deportation. In Spain, we visit a hamlet in the Basque country and a pagan festival once banned under General Franco. And finally, Australia's little nipper clubs teach children water safety from an early age, but perennial dangers still lurk in the deep. But first to Dubai, which has transformed into a glittering megacity in recent decades. Its vast skyscrapers, cavernous designer shopping malls, and tax-free living have drawn people from all over the world. But beneath the superficial glamour lies a dark underbelly and an international sex trade where women are often exploited and abused. Ranako Selina has been investigating the experiences of women from Uganda who first travelled to Dubai with big dreams.
It's 3 a.m. and we've just landed in Dubai. We're exhausted. But then, my colleague realises he's lost his passport. We're panicking, darting around the lobby of our 4-star hotel, searching for it. Looking in bags, jacket pockets, even rummaging through his previously padlocked suitcase in sheer desperation. The staff all around us, people who live in Dubai, are surprisingly calm. Don't worry, one of them tells me. This is Dubai, the safest city on earth. It'll turn up. And, like clockwork, it does. The next day, the passport is back with its owner. That phrase, the safest city on earth, stays with me. Because what brings me to Dubai is something very different. I'm investigating the deaths of 2 young women who fell from high tower blocks here, the type this city's skyline is famous for. Their families say they were told by authorities and contacts on the ground they'd taken their own lives, but they don't believe this. Monica Karungi and Kayla Burungi were both in their 20s. Both had big dreams, to become models, and then for Monica to become a doctor, to support their large families back home. And both were connected to the same man in Dubai. A man that Monica's family understood was her boss, and Kayla's family understood was her landlord. For their families and friends, Dubai didn't represent safety. It was the beginning of their nightmare. I wanted to understand the world they found themselves in. A world in which young women say they are drawn to Dubai with promises of jobs and opportunities, but end up in an industry where they are pushed into degrading sex work against their will. I decide the best way to investigate is to get out and speak to people. One night, I'm sitting at an outdoor bar in a bustling resort hotel. Music is thumping, cocktails are flowing. Everyone around me is dressed to impress. And I admit I've had a mini makeover to fit in here too. At the table directly in front of me, I overhear a glamorous woman tell a man, "I usually take men back to my place. It's safer that way." Negotiations ensue, and then, moments later, the 2 of them walk out together. I witness plenty more exchanges like this. Women from Russia, Vietnam, Uganda, jostling for attention. I get talking to Hope, who's from Uganda, and she tells me about her predicament. Brought to Dubai on the promise of a supermarket job, she says she was then tricked into prostitution. She thought she'd made her escape, and she started renting a flat from a Ugandan landlord, who it turned out was the same man Monica was indebted to before she fell to her death. Hope managed to get away. She's still not exactly free. She gave up a lot to be here, she says, selling land and taking out loans to pay for her ticket. She can't return home empty-handed, so now she's still here, still doing sex work, albeit on her own terms. Another woman tells me that even for those who do make it out and choose to go home, there's little help. She says the Dubai authorities don't seem to care about Africans, and I hear the same from others too. Lexi, who says she was forced into sex work by a trafficking network, described men she was made to see using racist abuse, calling women like her black monkeys. Some, she says, paid extra for violent or degrading acts, where the gratification came from humiliation. When she tried to call the police, she says they dismissed her, telling her, "You Africans cause problems for each other. We're tired of you," and hung up on her. Not so safe. We approached the Dubai police to ask them to respond to the allegations. They did not reply. I don't know or want to claim that this is every woman's predicament here. For some, this is work they go into with open eyes. But for others, I'm told repeatedly, there's little choice. I find myself thinking, this industry lives out loud here. An open secret. And it's a reminder. Dubai to me is like a master pickpocket. It dazzles you with the glitter of skyscrapers, gold-plated cars, shopping malls that double as ski slopes. Everywhere you turn, there's another spectacle tugging at your attention. But like any skilled thief, the trick is distraction. You leave dazzled, yes, but what did you miss while you weren't looking? As I'm called to board my plane back to the UK, I'm left thinking, that's Dubai's imbalance. A city selling glitz and limitless possibility, while still hiding deep inequality in its shadows.
Renako Selina, and you can hear more on Renako's investigation, Death in Dubai, on the World of Secrets podcast on BBC Sounds. The Dominican Republic is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Caribbean. 11 million people visited last year, though not all arrivals are welcome. The government there is currently undertaking a sweeping campaign to deport illegal immigrants, with many coming from neighbouring Haiti. The goal is to remove up to 500,000 Haitians, even though many work helping to build the tourist resorts which fuel the local economy. John Murphy met some of the Haitians living in fear of being sent home.
It was dark inside, no lights, but a young woman was sitting in the gloom at a table. "Do you change money?" I asked. "Yes." It was as she counted out the Dominican peso notes under her breath in French that I realized. "Are you Haitian?" I asked. "I am." I explained who we were and then inquired, "So, are you worried about the immigration people?" referring to the clampdown by the authorities. "Yes, I'm worried because I'm illegal, like all Haitians here," she replied. It turns out that 25-year-old Vanessa came here to Punta Cana, the main tourist center in the east of the Dominican Republic, 8 months ago, along with her mother and 2 cousins. They each paid 20,000 pesos, or £260, to, and this is in inverted commas, a travel agency, to get from the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, across the border into the Dominican Republic. "I don't know how it works. It's illegal," she added. They eventually reached the capital, Santo Domingo, by bus. From there, they had to make their own way over the final 120 miles to Punta Cana, trying to avoid immigration officials along the road. Once arrived, Vanessa says she got her job in this shop-cum-money exchange office through other Haitians. "We're safe here in the tourist areas," she explained. "They do the raids in the poor neighborhoods. My Haitian friends have been picked up," she said quietly. The Dominican president, Luis Abinader, has said he wants to expel all illegal Haitians. UN experts have said the government is at risk of violating international laws, but the president says the deportations are needed to prevent Haitian organised crime from infiltrating his country. The enforcement target is extraordinary, 10,000 a week. Immigration raids happen day and night, in workplaces, in homes. Derival was working in a local restaurant when immigration officials crashed through the door of her small home early one morning and arrested her 16-year-old daughter. She was only in a T-shirt. They didn't even let her get her clothes on or grab her phone, she said. Derival only found out when her daughter managed to borrow a phone from another Haitian and called her. By then, the teenager was hours away in a processing centre just outside the capital. They didn't give her any food or water, Derival told me. She had to sleep on the floor, and after 4 days, they sent her to the border. It was only then that a relative from Haiti was able to bring her daughter some clothes. According to Dominican law, minors, women who are breastfeeding, and the elderly should not be detained. Derival said it's too expensive to pay the smugglers to bring her daughter back. Anyway, life here is very difficult, she explained. I don't even sleep in this place. Each night I go into the hills to escape from the immigration. It's dangerous there. There are men who steal your stuff. On the edges of town, shabby breeze-block houses are encroaching into the forest scrub. We met Yonel, a Haitian in his 40s. He's been there 4 years and works as a welder. He told us a disturbing story. In July this year, his wife, who was heavily pregnant with their 5th child, went to a private clinic for a checkup, but they said she had to go to the state hospital. Once there, Yonel said the doctors told him she needed a caesarean section. He was allowed a brief visit to his wife and filmed a short video of her on his phone. An hour later, he was called back by the doctors. They told him his wife had died. He was completely shocked. But he said the police, who were there, erased his video and told him to stop crying, stop making a scene, or they'd call immigration. He claimed he had to pay the equivalent of £330 for his wife's body to be taken to the capital for an autopsy. The following day he got her body back. The baby had been cut out of her and placed by her side. It's not possible to verify everything Yonel said, but I did see a photo of the dead bodies of his wife and child. I'd like to go back to Haiti, he told me, but we can't because of what's happening there. Now, like Derival, he escapes to the hills at 2 a.m. every night to avoid the immigration raids. Do you think your children will ever be accepted by the Dominican authorities? I asked. No, he said despondently. Even on the birth certificates, it just says foreign.
John Murphy. Next, Denmark is among several European countries to have reported mysterious drone incursions in recent weeks, as unidentified craft were spotted hovering over military sites and airports. The Danish PM, Mette Frederiksen, told reporters at an EU leaders' summit in Copenhagen there was only one country willing to threaten us, and that is Russia, though Moscow has denied any involvement. This comes at a time when Denmark is already on edge over its national security, having recently decided to extend its mandatory military service to now include young women. Anna Holligan met some of the new recruits.
Flashing strobe lights dance branch to branch. A pole dancer twirls upside down. Ravers bounce as the beat pulsates. The prospect of war might seem far from this exuberant gathering under glowing fairy-like garlands at the Carousel Music Festival. Yet this vibrant crowd is packed with the very young people destined to be thrust onto the front line of Denmark's shifting policies. A girl in leathers with a tone of defiance tells me, "I don't think it's good for anybody to be forced to do anything. It's good to have choices. You do you, honey." "I would run away, honest," another confides. "We talk a lot about being equal here in Denmark," a young woman with a mojito and hot pants points out. "So, yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea." Recent events have brought the idea of conflict creeping closer. Just last week, multiple drones flying near military facilities brought Copenhagen's air traffic to a brief standstill, one of a series of mysterious incursions rattling Europe's sense of security. In the suburbs of the Danish capital, inside a grey office block, 29 people in their teens and early 20s have traipsed up 2 flights of stairs for one of the country's daily armed forces recruitment sessions. A documentary projected on the wall offers a snapshot of a serving soldier's life. Then the teens take cognitive tests, pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. When the time's up, we all exhale and step outside. Sarah and Molly are waiting, shoes off and sitting in their socks. "I want to become a sergeant," grins Molly. With her piercings and dyed red hair, she sees the army as an opportunity to develop discipline. Sarah explains, a lot more young people are starting to think they have to take action themselves rather than watch from the sidelines, since it's so close to home. 100%, Molly chips in. "I think everyone will join the military and want to do something, not just sit still and feel helpless." Senior Navy Commander Suna Lund hopes so. "For the first time in a long while, we have war on this continent. We want to pull our weight," he explains. By including women in the draft, Denmark wants to increase the gene pool of battle-ready teenagers, Commander Lund says. It's a lottery for those who decide not to volunteer. Men, and now women too, who must draw a lottery ticket from a black metal barrel. The number determines if and when they'll be called for national service-style military training, which has now more than doubled in length, from 4 to 11 months. We drive out to meet some of the newest recruits on a military base surrounded by fields and apple orchards. Wearing full combat fatigues, flak jackets and rifles slung over their shoulders, they run through basic battlefield drills, commando crawl through leafy undergrowth as gunfire echoes overhead. At lunchtime they find a clearing, refashion their rucksacks as picnic benches and pull out rations, including tasty-looking hummus, rye bread and tuna. For many of these teenagers, the main attraction is a spell of self-discovery and camaraderie, but flickers of scepticism exist elsewhere. In Christiania, the city's anarchist quarter, an artist named Marios worries about military expansion. If the government get away with this, they'll push further and build a bigger army. His 14-year-old daughter, Isabella, joins him on the steps of their self-built bungalow, which doubles as Marios' studio. She reflects on what it means to be a teenager in Denmark today, with talk of war on their doorstep. "I do not want to die, and I do not want PTSD, and also I'm scared about life on the battlefield as a woman." If she gets drafted, Isabella plans to register as a conscientious objector, but worries that could disrupt her dream of practicing law. As the sun dips behind the pine trees, casting golden shadows across the forest festival, Nadia, a young Ukrainian capturing the moment on camera, reflects on Denmark's new policy with a sense of relief. "If you're strong enough, you're probably less likely to be attacked," she says confidently. "I think it just makes Europe stronger and a safer place to be."
Anna Holligan.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Spain, where harvest festival season is getting into swing, and it's in the Basque country where you'll find some of the most enduring pagan celebrations in Europe. These autumn events often fold in elements of ancient traditions which go back far further than the Christian calendar. They offer a chance to celebrate the land and the people deeply rooted to it, showcasing a rich sense of local pride. Simon Bush has been joining in the festivities.
Lace petticoats are not something you'd normally associate with farm work, but here they are in abundance, flashing white in the early autumn sunshine in the courtyard of a smallholding in Navarre, northern Spain. Completing an improbably androgynous ensemble are tall feather-topped hats with gaily coloured ribbons, shaggy sheepskin jerkins, and enormous brass bells bound so tightly that they stick out straight from their wearers' backs like a pair of barnacles. Thus attired, the Yawalnak, among the oldest pagan characters in Europe, embodying an ancient melding of male and female symbols, begin to march. Stern-faced, the 40 or so strong company step high to sound those heavy bells about their midriffs. Their rhythmic clanging as they strut around the farmyard is ineffably moving, tapping into some primordial register as profound as it is difficult to name. Flicking horsehair switches to keep time, the twin lines of Yawalnak now loop in upon themselves, stomping across the cobbles in incongruously dainty-looking espadrilles one last time before suddenly they stop. Spell-broken, these farmers in ordinary life, and these days doctors and dentists too, doff their towering witches' hats. Smiles break out and they tuck into homemade sausages and cider laid out in thanks for their annual blessing of the smallholding. The Yawalnak will need this mini-feast because they'll soon be marching off to bless the next patch of land. But now, as the Yawalnak munch upon their well-earned sausages, up step different champions of an increasingly vital Basque culture, a pair of Bertsalares. These rhyming bards conjure with the Basque language, apparently unrelated to any other living tongue. Clues, such as a root word meaning stone for axes and other things now made of metal, tantalizingly suggest that Basque might hark back to the early speech of the Cro-Magnons. Yet Bertsalares wield this ancient language with up-to-the-moment topicality. They have to. They're paid to come up with new rhymes on the spot. Inflatioia, might inspire a stanza, the war in the Middle East another. You do get stressed. You think, what am I going to say? Says Aitor Mendeluce, one of the Bertsalari pair performing in the farmyard. He and his fellow Bertsalari, Jesus Mariaraki, downbeat poets both in jeans and windbreakers, have been given a theme, the doings of this small holdings family. They up the rhyming ante with sing-song verbal volleys fitting a fixed metre. Thanks for all this glorious food, Aitor cries. But who will work now? We're not in the mood. Jesus chimes in. It's going to be a long day, you'd think. We'd be clever enough not to drink. It's the Bertsalari's skill to prime the crowd for a rhyme's ending. As Aitor and Jesus' poetic duel hots up, the Basques gathered here are clearly on tenterhooks. A chorus rises from the farmyard as everyone joins in to complete each rhyming couplet. Now, Yawalnak and Bertsalaris aren't traditions pickled in aspic and hauled out for tourists, but instead have learned to dance nimbly with the times. Yawalnak are only getting stronger, says Lázaro Ergarena Aristegui, genial member of a troupe for 60 years. That's partly because women can now march too. Some play the bells better than men, Lázaro tells me. As for the Bertsalaris, I recall the Martin Amis short story imagining a world where poets are literary royalty courted by Hollywood and travelling the world first class. Perhaps he'd been to the Basque country, for Bertsalaris are local heroes. There are Bertsalari training schools, thousands crowd performances by the best-known bards. It's ironic, given that, under the fascist Franco, just speaking Basque could get you punished. And Basques still feel a spiky affinity with, as they see it, other oppressed groups. Palestinian flags are everywhere in the Basque country, and there can't be many places in the world where street signs warn against sexism. Yet, even if Spanish Basques do still talk of going on holiday to Spain, what strikes you about this self-assertion is this. It's not self-assertion that seems to diminish anyone else. These days it seems enough to be proud to be Basque.
Simon Bush. And finally, Australia's known for its wildlife. The cuddly koala and the kangaroo are probably its most iconic creatures, but also the venomous snakes, spiders and sharks. In fact, while still rare, Australia sees the highest rate of shark attacks in the world. But it doesn't stop millions of people enjoying the beaches and the ocean. So, what can Australians' love of the outdoors, no matter the dangers, teach us? Katie Watson reports from Sydney.
The sun's out and the weather's warming up, finally. It's always a good feeling after Sydney winters, which are colder than I bargained for when I moved to Australia. And with summer fast approaching, the beaches are also getting fuller, which is the perfect cue for me to enrol my children in another season of Nippers. Nippers is a rite of passage for many Australian kids, a junior surf lifesaving programme that takes place on almost every beach throughout the warmer months. It helps build confidence in the ocean and teaches children about water safety. Everyone comes to class kitted out in a club vest and a coloured swim cap. Every week's lesson involves races in the sand, paddles on surfboards and swims in the open water, with the children accompanied throughout by volunteer lifeguards or surf lifesavers, watching their every move. My eldest son isn't a fan. Last year he told me he'd nearly died from a freak wave. As a parent sitting on the shore, I admit I sometimes watch in disbelief at what these little kids managed to do, but I assured him that while he may have been a bit frightened, he was in safe hands. Nippers for me symbolises what is so great about Australia's attitude to the outdoors and the extraordinary and often incredibly scary wildlife on its doorstep. Here, surf lifesaving is a community sport like no other. After graduating from Nippers, you can choose to volunteer and help others. It becomes a way of life for many, which is why a recent fatal shark attack on Sydney's northern beaches hit so hard. Mercury Salakis, a 57-year-old husband and father, was killed by a shark last month while surfing with his friends at a surf spot called Longreef. It was a particularly brutal death and a very rare one. He was only the second person to die after a shark attack in Sydney in around 60 years. My kids had been on that beach, playing in the shallow waters, just the weekend before. Glenn Butler was on the beach that same morning. A surfer for 50 years, he'd gone out with his mates before showering and then heading home. As he drove out, Glenn noticed lots of police cars and ambulances coming past. It was a bit odd for that hour of the morning, and by the time I got home, my phone just lit up, he tells me. Everybody was calling to see if we were okay, because they knew we'd all gone for a surf. Glenn rarely thought about sharks before the attack. You're aware you're stepping into their environment, he says, so you're cautious, but there are basic things to be aware of. Early morning and evening feeding times, and of course, large schools of fish. Stay clear of those, he tells me. There are usually bigger creatures chasing them. Everyone who surfed at Longreef knew Mercury and his identical twin brother Mike. They were well respected for being top surfers. No one surfed on the beach that first week after the attack. It just didn't feel right, said Ian Brown, who also surfs at Longreef. But it's important to get back on the board, he says. You have to override your fears, otherwise you're just paralysed. I use that to motivate me for lots of things in life. And that seems to be the Australian approach. There's a love of the outdoors so great that almost any challenge can be overcome. But there is a growing feeling of disquiet. Several times these past weeks, I've heard surfers voice concern about shark sightings being on the up. Is that because more people are in the water, or more sharks? Perhaps warmer waters are changing the sharks' hunting patterns. There are all sorts of theories. Other people have decided to focus on the nets. Mercury died on a beach that had a shark net, and it's reignited the debate about their safety record. At 150 metres long, they only screen off short stretches of most beaches. Sharks can swim over, under and around them. But, say their proponents, they still interrupt the sharks' movements and hopefully ward them off. Only researchers also pointed out that the trapped turtles and dolphins that become unfortunate victims of the nets might also become bait for the sharks, thereby attracting them towards populated areas. Authorities aren't prepared to remove them for fear of another attack. Everyone, though, agrees on one thing. If you enter the ocean, you're entering the shark's world. There's no such thing as zero risk. And for many, adrenaline is part of it, the thrill and the beauty. The enjoyment that surfing brings is such an addictive passion, says Glenn. I'm just hoping that time heals the wounds to get back to life as normal.
Katie Watson, and that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Please join us then.
Nature Bang.
Hello.
Hello.
And welcome to Nature Bang.
I'm Becky Ripley.
I'm Emily Knight.
And in this series from BBC Radio 4, we look to the natural world to answer some of life's big questions.
Like, how can a brainless slime mould help us solve complex mapping problems?
And what can an octopus teach us about the relationship between mind and body?
It really stretches your understanding of consciousness.
With the help of evolutionary biologists,
I'm actually always very comfortable comparing us to other species.
Philosophers.
You never really know what it could be like to be another creature.
And spongeologists. Is that your job title? Are you a spongeologist?
Well, I am in certain spheres.
It's science meets storytelling.
With a philosophical twist.
It really gets to the heart of free will and what it means to be you.
So if you want to find out more about yourself
via cockatoos that dance, frogs that freeze, and single-cell amoebas that design border policies,
subscribe to Nature Bang from BBC Radio 4, available on BBC Sounds. Bang!
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today we're in Nepal, at the scene of Gen Z-led protests triggered by a social media ban and the luxurious lives of political Nepo babies. In an age of recycling and upcycling, we hear why market traders in Ghana have had their fill of charitable donations. And finally, we're in the self-declared state of Transnistria, where citizens still have a vote in the upcoming elections in Moldova. But first, migration has once again been much in focus, with the government's one-in, one-out policy off to a faltering start. More than 30,000 people have crossed the Channel this year, and during his state visit this week, US President Donald Trump suggested the UK employ the military to stop illegal migration. Managing the irregular movement of people is a challenge facing governments around the world, and here Fergal Keane retraces the migrant routes he has followed over the decades and the people he's met along the way.
The first thing I noticed was their accents. They sounded to me like people on the television news. In fact, they were the people from the news. We'd seen them coming across the border, and the pictures of houses burning, the camps where they were given cups of tea, and the pictures of our soldiers walking along small frontier lanes, and our Taoiseach, Prime Minister, saying the Irish government could no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse. That was August 1969, and in Northern Ireland, parts of Belfast and Derry were in flames. Catholic neighbourhoods were under siege, and 1,500 families would flee into the Republic. I was 8 years old, staying in a small village on the southeast coast, dreaming my summer days away, swimming and fishing in the security of my grandmother's rented seaside cottage. The northern trouble felt far away from me. And then those kids appeared. Maybe they were being given refuge with relatives in the locality, or the people running the reception camps had decided to give them a trip to the coast. What I remember is feeling that there was a different energy about them as they walked past me on our single sleepy street. Something heightened and angry that made me shrink back. Whatever they'd seen 250 miles up the road lay between us. A border between life experiences, between a world that was predictable and another in which anything, up to and including murder and maiming, might occur. So often in the last 4 decades as a journalist, I've had occasion to reflect on that invisible frontier, between the good and bad fortune of where and to whom we are born, between my world and that of the people on the other side of our cameras and microphones. 10 years ago this week, I was on a road in southern Europe, following the journeys of hundreds of thousands of people heading into the EU, in what became known as the Great European Migration Crisis. In all, over 1 million people crossed the frontiers of the Union that year. The majority were from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq. But I met others from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, Somalia. On a beach on the Greek island of Lesbos, we'd paused our work to eat lunch when I saw the small dinghies bearing toward us across the sea from the Turkish shore. And it seemed like only minutes before they reached the shallows in front of the restaurant, and people of different nations were jumping clear and crying out with joy and relief. The younger men often dived off the overcrowded craft and swam the last metres to land. That night I filed my report for the nightly news and, as I often do, wrote down my impressions of the previous days in the form of verse. It's a form of journaling that works for me, a means to briefly try and touch the purely human across all that separates different worlds. I wrote, "Had I ever seen such hope? That woman from Damascus crying, 'I am safe', the Greek waitress going from family to family with gifts of tenderness and water. They crowded around us. How far to the town? How far to Athens? How far to Germany? On the march out of Homs, under the shells of Kobane, leaving behind their houses, farms, shops, leaving the graves of parents and children, they came, the blistered and the lame, the hardy and game, calling out, 'How far to the future?' 'As far as you can walk,' I should have answered, and then some more. One morning not far across the sea in the Turkish city of Bodrum, whose streets were crowded with Syrians fleeing their country's civil war, I met a man whose 5-year-old son had fractured his leg during their escape. They were desperate for help, with nobody to turn to. We set aside the demands of our work for a few hours. We didn't film the heartrending scene. We put father and son into our vehicle and searched for a hospital where the boy could be treated. And then went on ourselves, found a hotel, booked them a room there and paid for it out of our own pockets. We brought the room key back to 44-year-old Abdul Menem al-Satouf in the emergency room. That key, for 10 years unknown to me, it connected our team to this Syrian refugee father. Because when the family moved on a week or so later and crossed successfully to Europe, Abdul Menem put his hand in his pocket on the boat and found that the key was still there. "I felt so guilty," he told me last week. "I often thought of you and wondered how I could get the key back to the hotel because they could be angry with you." We were sitting in his flat in the Swedish city of Karlstad, surrounded by his 5 children. Among them, Hamza, the boy we took to hospital, whose leg is long healed and who now plays football for his school team. Abdul Menem works as a cleaner in apartment buildings in one of the affluent areas of Karlstad. His wife Noor used to work, but now takes care of the children. All of the family speak Swedish. All of the children attend local state schools. When they arrived 10 years ago, there were welcomes and help to integrate. That has changed, Noor says. They look at us as if we only came here to take their money or live off their aid, but that's not true. When I first arrived, I studied Swedish for 2 years. I learned the language. I finished school. Then I went to work, cleaning kitchens, doing childcare. I pay taxes here, just like anyone else. I'm part of this society. Noor had cooked a Syrian meal for us. Peppers stuffed with rice, lamb in a rich gravy, kibbe, ground lamb and pine nuts deep fried. She spoke of the Syrian world she missed, the neighbours, the friends, the easy coming and going from house to house. All that existed before the Civil War, and to which in her mind she returned again and again. Sweden had long been looked on by other European nations as a bastion of liberalism, with a reputation for welcoming those fleeing political persecution. But in 2022, the far-right, anti-migrant Sweden Democrats Party won more than 20% of the vote in a general election, becoming the second largest party and able to shape the new minority government's policy on migration. It's now more difficult for people to bring other family members to join them in Sweden. Conditions for permanent residency have been tightened. Asylum quotas are substantially reduced. What prompted so many Swedes to support a far-right party? The full answer to that would take much longer than I have at my disposal here. But one of the most frequently cited reasons in local media and by politicians is crime. Since 2013, the rate of gun crime in the country has more than doubled. And people born abroad and their children born in Sweden are overrepresented in crime statistics. Swedes have been disturbed by the instances of children being used by organised crime gangs to commit serious crimes, including murder. Sweden's foreign ministry says low levels of education, unemployment, social segregation, and the war trauma of refugees are all root causes, not the solitary fact of being a migrant. There is much political debate, but the rumour mills and conspiracy theories of social media too often block out reasoned discussion of the causes and possible solutions. We are propelled by algorithms ever deeper into fear. We want answers, solutions. The EU has responded by subcontracting some of its migration controls to states like Libya and Tunisia. Human rights organisations report widespread abuses as a consequence. But there's no visible outrage in Europe, nor is it likely there will be. Because even 10 years ago, when the volunteers welcomed fleeing people at German railway stations, Europe was already wearying and becoming more fearful of migration. Terror attacks in Paris earlier that year, and sexual violence in German cities on New Year's Eve, much of it carried out by recent arrivals, accelerated the alienation. I'm a reporter. I can only speak of the things I have seen and of the impressions they've left me with. And so I go back to the verse from 10 years ago, and reading it now, sense my foreboding even then for a world in which there would be no end to people in flight. That old man at Tvornik on a day of chaos and angry young men and trampled women. He came from Herat, and he dropped like a stone, his heart failing in the Balkan autumn. How we worked on his chest, pumping up and down, and how each gasp was the sound of life fighting for itself. It fought and won. But Mustafa and his lost tribe must wander on from border to border, through the vineyards and orchards, through the cornfields of Horgoz, around and around, back and beyond, until they meet the steel embrace of wire and gates. I fall asleep to the sound of feet marching, and know they will march forever.
Fergal Keane. Last week, in just under 48 hours, Nepal's government was dramatically overthrown in the deadliest unrest seen in the Himalayan country in decades. 72 people were killed as official buildings, leaders' residences and luxury hotels were torched and vandalised. The demonstrations were triggered by a government decision to block 26 social media platforms, including WhatsApp, Instagram and Facebook, for failing to meet a deadline to register with Nepal's communication ministry, though the root cause of the public anger runs much deeper. Charlotte Scar was in the capital.
I arrived on a cloudy morning in Kathmandu, where I'd been sent to cover the protests that had mobilised the country's younger generation after a social media ban had triggered mass protests and violent clashes. But as I arrived, I discovered the ban had been revoked and the country's Home Affairs Minister had resigned. I thought the story was over. Nevertheless, we decided to head to where the unrest had taken place the previous day. Outside the gate of Nepal's federal parliament, we met 32-year-old Kamal Sabedi. He was standing alone on an empty street, tall, stoic-looking and visibly tired. But he seemed eager to talk. He recalled the day before, telling us he'd been standing on the same spot as he watched his cousin, Yugendra Napani, drop to the ground after being shot in the back of the head. Yugendra was just 23 and had been studying for government exams at college. We were trying to save him, Kamal told us, but the police continuously fired bullets, he added. He spoke fluently, almost without taking a breath, determined to tell us everything he'd seen. As we spoke, Nepal's armed police arrived, lining up in ranks wearing body armour with protective shields, guarding the gates of Parliament in case new protests emerged. I couldn't hide inside my home, hiding my emotion, Kamal went on. He told me he came out again to be heard, hoping that his cousin's death could mean something. Kamal insisted the protests were about much more than a ban on social media. In the weeks before, frustrations about the level of corruption in Nepal had been widely circulating online. The hashtag #NepoBabies was used to share photos and videos of the lavish lifestyles of the children of the country's powerful politicians. One of the viral images showed the son of a government minister posing next to a Christmas tree made from boxes bearing the logos of the luxury brands Cartier and Louis Vuitton. With an unemployment rate of 10% and more than 20% of the population living under the poverty line, these images infuriated so many. We followed more protesters as they began to gather for a second day outside government buildings. Undeterred, they carried placards reading, "Enough is enough," and "End corruption," shouting in chorus, "Everyone suffers because of the Prime Minister." The crowd swelled, their shouts became louder. In the distance, we could hear confrontations between protesters and armed police. Loud bangs of tear gas cut through the cacophony of the protests. Dozens of people ran towards us, and we hurriedly grabbed our camera equipment, sprinting down a side street. Military helicopters circled overhead. We heard the news that Kathmandu International Airport had been closed, forcing the plane carrying more BBC staff and other reporters to turn around in mid-air. We watched as protesters pushed towards the lines of the armed police, and then retreated speedily to the sound of bullets being fired. Just opposite, the government's survey department had been set on fire. Smoke soon spread to the streets, and the smell of petrol filled the air. The crowds divided as motorbikes drove through, carrying the injured to the nearest hospital. Breaking news flashed up on my colleague Rajneesh's phone. The Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli had resigned, and despite the speed at which everything had unravelled, it also felt inevitable. In quick succession, we heard reports that more government buildings were in flames and that the homes of many ministers, including the Prime Minister, had been vandalised. As night descended on the city and protesters began to celebrate, we followed the crowd into the federal parliament buildings. Scooters circled the gardens. Many were carrying paintings and other looted items, including garden plants. Dozens more were gathered around a fire at the steps of the building, waving the Nepali flag. Shattered glass crunched underfoot from blown-out windows. Spray-painted walls read, "You picked the wrong fight." A few days later, I met Kamal again outside the mortuary of one of the main hospitals where families of those killed during the protests were gathering, waiting for their bodies to be released. Nepal's army had been deployed to the streets to keep the peace, and Gen Z movement leaders had selected the former Chief Justice, Sushila Karki, as the country's interim Prime Minister. New elections had been announced for March of next year. Kamal had made contact with the relatives of all those who died,
And that morning he met with the country's temporary new leader to present 15 demands, including a full investigation into what happened over the 2 days and an end to corruption in Nepal, all of which she promised to honour. But as volunteers begin the process of clearing up the capital street by street, the country waits to see if the new government can restore trust in the democratic process.
Charlotte Scarr.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Ghana has been called the fashion industry's dumping ground. It's the world's largest importer of used clothing, with millions of garments arriving every week, donated from countries like the UK and US. But it's often the quality, not the quantity, which is proving a problem. Hannah Gelbart has been to Accra to see the global impact of fast fashion.
It's just after 7 in the morning on Usherfort Beach, and 150 people in high-vis jackets, rubber gloves and wellies are here for a clean-up. I pull on a face mask to cover my nose and mouth from the stench of rotting waste and head down the steps to the shore. I've never seen a beach like it. Rats dart through mounds of rubbish. The sand is almost invisible beneath heaps of plastic bags, bottles and shredded fabric. There are bits of hats, sneakers, ripped underwear, and the sleeve of a blue and yellow floral shirt. The print reminds me of a summer dress I have at home in London. 2 volunteers heave a thick tangle of fabric out of the sea. Others rake through the sand or wade into the water, filling baskets with colourful material carried in on the waves. They bag up the waste to take it to a rubbish dump further afield. After an hour, the sand finally begins to show through. But within a week, I'm told, it'll all be covered up again. This is the afterlife of fast fashion. Locals call Ghana's second-hand clothing Obroniwawu, which means dead white people's clothes. It's a phrase from colonial times that once meant high-quality cotton or silk, often donated after someone's death. Now it's a tide of polyester and nylon, sent by people who are very much alive. The cleanup is organised by an environmental charity, the Our Foundation. Its ecological research manager, Joe Ayesu, explains how the waste gets here. From textile bins and charity shops in the West, bales of clothes are imported for resale at Ghana's second-hand markets. Items that can't be resold end up in nearby rubbish dumps. When it rains, they're washed into lagoons, pollute waterways and flow into the sea, where they'll never biodegrade. It's a practice that was banned in Uganda a few years ago on the basis that it harms local textile industries, and there have been attempts to limit imports and improve accountability in Ghana too, though there's still a lot of work to do. At their office, the charity's head of fashion development, Sami Oteng, calls the problem waste colonialism, wealthy nations sending their waste to poorer ones. Yes, many Ghanaians do make a living from the second-hand trade, he says, but the sheer volume is now overwhelming. The quality of the clothing has also declined, and traders are struggling to make money from what they receive. The charity tries to repurpose the waste, turning it into cushion stuffings or mop heads, but upcycling uses a lot of resources. In a country of nearly 35 million people, Sami says, receiving 15 million garments a week simply isn't sustainable. We walk to Kantamanto Market in downtown Accra, which is said to be the largest second-hand clothing market in the world. It's sprawling and chaotic. Stalls overflow with T-shirts and shorts from well-known high street brands. Right in the centre of the market, in a section that feels like a production line, are the upcyclers. They buy huge bales of recycled clothing and wash, sew, mend and dye it. There's the button man with his pile of reclaimed colourful buttons, an ironing station, shoe repairers and row after row of sewing machines. One upcycler, who's introduced as Auntie Charlotte, shows me how she makes children's boxer shorts from long-sleeved cotton shirts, the seams under the arms forming the crotch. She makes around 400 pairs a day, some sold in villages, others in countries across West Africa. But many items she receives these days can't be used. They're too damaged, too stained or too synthetic. Polyester, she says, is hot and uncomfortable. Ruth, another upcycler, also makes underwear from old cotton pillowcases. She holds one up, the print barely visible, the fabric worn thin. We're angry, she tells me. This is waste, not clothing. We're business partners. We pay with our hard-earned money to buy these things. By the end of the day, you receive the money and then you give me waste. We don't want this anymore. Those business partners are the importers of used clothing. I leave the market and think back to the beach, to that blue and yellow shirt half buried in the sand. So many of the prints and labels I've seen here would be at home in my own wardrobe, and I wonder, the next time I bag up my old clothes for donation, will they end up in someone's closet or rotting on a faraway beach? That morning, I'd asked Joe what could be done to break this cycle. He says it starts with the brands. If they used eco-friendly materials and focused on quality rather than quantity, then there wouldn't be so much waste on Ghana's beaches. But he also wants shoppers in Europe and elsewhere to buy only what they need. Quality clothes we can wear for years, mend and repurpose. As fast fashion has grown, he says, clothes have become cheaper, synthetic and disposable. In Ghana, they end up polluting the sand and the sea while suffocating the people who live by them.
Hannah Gelbart. And finally, in East Moldova, along the border with Ukraine, the separatist state of Transnistria. Home to around 350,000 people, the region broke away from Moldova in 1990, though neither Moldova or the international community recognises its self-declared independence. The region benefits from Russian support. Moscow has around 1,500 troops posted there, and despite the schism, people still have a say in what goes on in Moldova, and will be allowed to vote in next weekend's election. Peter Young recently paid a visit.
I've crossed many land borders in my life, but none were quite like Transnistria's. A couple of hours of bumpy road from Moldova's capital, Chisinau. Our Matrushka-shared taxi van pulled up at an otherwise deserted crossing, and I, along with a dozen other riders, filed out to the border post to have our documents checked by a man in a sombre Soviet-style uniform and an excessively large hat. A massive emblem of Transnistria loomed over us on the border post, featuring a hammer and sickle, wheat, corn and grapes, the crops of the region, and a sun rising above the Dniester, a river that more or less demarcates the declared border with Moldova. To the side, a troop of surly Russian soldiers with large rifles stood next to a tank and surveilled the scene. After asking how long I planned to stay, I was given a piece of paper by the border guard instead of receiving an entry stamp in my passport, as it's not an internationally recognized state. And within a few minutes, we were back on the road again. Pulling up to Tiraspol, the capital of this breakaway region, it was clear that I was in a unique and quite frankly peculiar place. For 3 decades, Transnistria has had its own government, parliament, police, postal system, flag, license plates, and currency, the Transnistrian ruble, which in some places is still traded in the form of plastic coins. Here, all the signs were in Russian, and unlike in Moldova, where the deep blue EU flag is omnipresent as the nation tries to join the bloc, in Transnistria, the Russian tricolour reigns. In front of the parliament building, there's a grand statue of Lenin, standing atop a pink granite pillar, his coat sweeping dramatically to the side. Brutalist Soviet-era buildings line the streets. Those were better times, said Sasha, a 50-year-old with tightly cropped hair, musing about life under the former Soviet Union. I met him in a city market, where he sells Soviet memorabilia, ranging from military caps and badges to Lenin effigies. Before, the Ukrainians were our brothers, he told me. We worked together hand in hand, in unity. But now they are our enemies, he sighed, before adding, Zelensky and the EU. They are behind this. They are greedy. That's why they started this war. Sasha is far from the only person here to falsely believe Ukraine started the war with Russia or harbour reservations over Europe. During a Moldova-wide referendum in 2024, more than 60% of Transnistrians voted against adding a pro-EU amendment to the constitution, even though that figure was lower than some expected. Bernard, a middle-aged Frenchman from Toulouse, told me that he moved to Tiraspol after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in search of a more simple life, far away from the chaos and uncertainty of a rapidly changing Western world. I'd known about this place for a long time, he said. I appreciate the traditional values here. You don't have to worry about things like that LGBT nonsense. But Tiraspol, for all its Soviet-style canteens, babushkas and creaking buses, wasn't quite a pristine time capsule from the 1970s either. Teenagers in trendy sneakers stroll around glued to their smartphones, and stylishly dressed women parade in designer clothes, just like in any major cosmopolitan city. Perhaps most surprising was the sight of a statue of Harry Potter, wearing his iconic glasses and with an owl in his shoulder in front of a university faculty. It seems that Transnistria these days is treated by its residents, particularly the younger ones, as more of a marriage of convenience, rather than as a place for hardline devotion, especially since Russia has resumed piping gas to the region practically for free. Last year, 35-year-old local Andrew and his girlfriend set up a hipster coffee shop in the city centre that plays vintage vinyl records. The pair were reluctant to talk about politics, yet at ease discussing Beatles bootlegs. We're happy here. There are some problems, but the gas is so cheap, he said. Others were less ambivalent about this Soviet relic in the crosshairs of Russia. With TikTok, Telegram and high-speed internet, young people are regularly exposed to exciting, alternative worlds. Life in conservative Transnistria pales in comparison. Russia, despite its efforts to flood social media with disinformation, is at risk of losing the culture wars here. Tiraspol is very boring. It's full of irritating people, said Xenia, a 20-something waitress in a drab canteen. I want to leave as soon as I can.
Peter Young. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Please join us then.
From BBC Radio 4, The Fort. Royal Marines and Army pilots speaking for the first time.
We felt there were Taliban fighters coming through this complex called Jugram Fort.
It was the most intense firefight I've ever been involved in.
The word gets around that 40 is missing.
The Apache pilot said to me, you just need 4 volunteers. We secure them to the Apache wings and we'll go back and get Lance Corporal Ford.
Get me 4 Marines and I will take them in and we'll get that boy home.
Listen to The Fort on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today, it's been a week of major talks for Donald Trump in East Asia. The president said his meeting with China's Xi Jinping was 12 out of 10, but there's still no trade deal on the table. And in Japan, Mr. Trump was lavished with golfing gifts from the country's first female prime minister, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It's harvest time for olive farmers in the occupied West Bank, but the season's been blighted by rising attacks by Israeli settlers. And in Ireland, we hear how British protesters flew out to join Irish anti-immigration rallies as the country voted in a new president. But first to Argentina. For decades, the country's cycle of boom and bust seemed endless, ushering in periods of painful austerity and international bailouts. But 2 years ago, a chainsaw-wielding, self-styled anarcho-capitalist called Javier Milei promised a way out of all of that. Since then, he's shown some signs of being able to shrink the state, though not without controversy. So last weekend's midterm elections were a crucial test of his support. Irony Wells was there.
About 3 weeks before Argentina's midterm elections, a large crowd gathered at an arena in Buenos Aires to watch a rock concert. The singer, shaggy-haired and donning his signature black leather jacket, roared the lyrics of an emblematic Argentine rock song called Panic Show. "I am the lion," he cried in Spanish. "Please don't run away from me. I am the king of a lost world." That singer was Argentina's libertarian president, Javier Milei. The lyrics may well have been a plea to his country. He came to power 2 years ago, but recently his government has been rocked by multiple political and economic challenges. There have been signs the public were tiring of his radical austerity measures, the cuts to pensions, transport and utilities subsidies, infrastructure, health and education. His party had recently performed badly in provincial elections, where his convoy was pelted with rocks on the campaign trail. His government has also been marred by corruption scandals, including one involving his sister, his closest aide. The country's financial reserves were dwindling as the central government propped up the currency with billions of dollars of debt due within months. Financial markets were panicking, fearing a fiscal crisis was imminent. And yet, against this backdrop, President Milei led his party to an astonishing victory in the midterms, gaining many more seats in Congress and making it easier to push ahead with his cost-cutting agenda. So, what went right? It can't have been the pyrotechnics or his renditions of Argentine rock songs, which, even he might admit, were not particularly in tune. His austerity measures have achieved headline results. Inflation has fallen from the triple digits level before he came to office. The state is now spending less than it's earning, something that may mean little to ordinary people, but has reassured investors. He's also won the support of Donald Trump, whose government has offered Argentina a $40 billion financial package made up of a currency swap, direct purchases of pesos, and private investment to help drag the peso back from collapse. But while those headlines have delighted die-hard supporters, the kind who turn up at his rock show rallies, voters I've spoken to over recent months suggest that alone wasn't what swung it. I unfortunately cast a vote for the current government, but no, I'm not happy, Dardo, a Buenos Aires business owner, told me. Despite lower inflation, cuts to subsidies have sent his fuel, health plans, rent and other costs higher. The middle and working classes are suffering too much, he said. Yet he and his son agreed the government should at least still be given the chance to deliver. If the government is to achieve what it has said it will and deliver change, his son Nerio added, it needs the support of more senators and representatives, not to be punished. For many, that desire for change is rooted in frustration with government's past. The populist, nationalist Peronism movement and its modern left-wing incarnation, Kirchnerism, dominated Argentina for decades. Both championed high levels of state intervention, welfare and subsidies. While they still have loyal bases, critics, especially Mr. Millet, argue years of overspending and corruption crippled the economy. Everything is expensive. Electricity, water, rent, vegetables, clothes, one woman lamented to me while walking her dogs. But the president took office not long ago. 2 years is nothing. Argentina's been in bad shape for 40, 50 years. On election night, crowds gathered outside a hotel where the president was watching the results. A roar went up when the news broke that he'd gained more seats. Our province was devastated by the last government. Now, thank God, freedom has won, one supporter told me. A young student, Dionisio, said Millet is bringing change to the country. After so many years of Peronist and Kirchnerist governments that destroyed our culture and economy, I think this is the best there can be. Not all share this view. I have also spoken with pensioners, struggling after their pension fell in real terms, with manufacturers who speak of shuttered factories and thousands of job losses due to falling demand and the prospect of an imminent recession, with a woman who works with disabled children, concerned about how cuts will affect them. For these people, Javier Millet's cuts are not worth the human cost, even if they have achieved some macroeconomic successes that his supporters cheer on. For all those in between, though, the group of voters that likely swung this in the end, it seems that the hope for a different path was the key. Even if they're not happy with his methods, many are still prepared to give Javier Millet the chance to implement change, any change, after years of disappointment with their political classes.
Irony Wells. Next, the meeting between China's President Xi Jinping and the US President Donald Trump this week at Busan Airport in South Korea was analysed intently for any signs of a breakthrough on the two countries' trade standoff. In the end, Mr. Trump agreed to lower his so-called fentanyl tariff in return for an end to the rare earths roadblock and a pledge from China to buy large amounts of soybeans from US farmers. But details of the discussions were minimal, and no new deal was actually signed. Our China correspondent, Laura Bicker, followed the encounter.
President Donald Trump came away from his meeting with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping full of bombastic optimism. He called it a great success and rated it 12 on a scale of 1 to 10. China was less enthusiastic. Beijing's initial statement sounds like an instruction manual, with Mr. Xi urging teams on both sides to follow up as soon as possible. The US has agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese imports, and China will suspend controls on the export of rare earths, critical minerals without which you cannot make smartphones, electric cars, and perhaps more crucially, military equipment, but only for 1 year. It has become clear that this is not a trade deal. It's a temporary truce. It will bring the world's two biggest economies back from the brink of an all-out trade war. But it won't solve the differences at the heart of such a competitive relationship. China has also learned key lessons from this dispute, which has its roots in Mr. Trump's first term in office. Just days after he announced new tariffs on Chinese goods in February this year, Mr. Xi appeared to have a plan. He decided to use the country's economic weight as the world's factory, as a massive market for its goods, to push back. Beijing would fight until the bitter end, was the message from various ministries. As one analyst put it, China escalated to de-escalate, which was a very new tactic. For the first time, Beijing limited exports of rare earths to the US, and China processes around 90% of the world's rare earth metals. American car manufacturers in particular were soon pleading with the Trump administration to find a way to do a deal. China also stopped buying US soybeans, which was aimed at hurting farmers in Republican states and Mr. Trump's voting base. Beijing has spent the last 4 years finding new trade partners and relying less on US exports. Nearly a fifth of Chinese exports once went to the US, but in the first half of this year, that figure dropped to 11%. So when Mr. Xi showed up in South Korea to meet Donald Trump, he seemed confident and may have believed he was coming to the table with a strong hand. As usual, he was in front of Donald Trump for the initial handshake. He stood unblinking as Mr. Trump leaned forward to whisper in his ear, the kind of ad-lib moment China abhors. During the talks, as the two sides lined the negotiating table, it became clear China had come to negotiate, not capitulate. And so Mr. Trump turned on the charm, praising Mr. Xi as a great leader, and said it was a great honour to meet him again. At the end of the meeting, Mr. Trump ushered the Chinese leader to his waiting car, where Mr. Xi was immediately surrounded by his own security team. The US president was then left alone to wander off and find his own vehicle. China likes this kind of careful choreography, which was evident even outside the summit venue. The Chinese embassy had brought dozens of its staff to line the streets and wave flags and welcome their leader to South Korea for the first time in 11 years. Officials could be heard directing them when to wave and when to cheer as they waited for his car. Anti-Chinese protesters in South Korea were kept well away from the route. There are many positives to take away from this superpower summit, the first of Donald Trump's second term in office. For starters, businesses, the markets and other countries caught in between the rivals will welcome the calm. That includes the host country, South Korea. Seoul needs the US for security, but China is its biggest trading partner. Countries across Asia have tried to flatter Mr. Trump to get a better trade deal. Japan's Prime Minister plans to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize, so claims Donald Trump's press secretary. South Korea's leader Lee Jae-myung gave him a crown. There has been no such adulation from China. As Mr. Trump walked up the steps of Air Force One to return to Washington just after his summit with President Xi, he raised his fist in celebration. But has he really got the bigger, better deal with China he's always wanted? Not yet. Even if he does get a deal and the two sides put ink to paper, Beijing has now shown that it's not willing to bend to Washington and that it's more resilient. The rivalry between the two sides is likely to continue if, or even when, there's ever a done deal.
Laura Becker. Earlier on his East Asia tour, Donald Trump met with Japan's first female Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, the first state visit she's hosted since being elected just over a week ago. Although the road to securing her own premiership was far from smooth, she did have one advantage in this encounter, her close connection to former PM Shinzo Abe, a key ally and former golfing buddy of Mr. Trump. The president lavished praise on Ms. Takaichi, whose politics many have compared to Margaret Thatcher, and the relationship with Washington serves an important purpose for Tokyo, that of countering China's rising influence in the region. Here's our Japan correspondent, Shaima Khalil.
It's been called many things: a baptism of fire, the big test, and her diplomatic debut. All that is true. But think about this. If you're a young girl growing up in Japan right now, you will have seen your country's first ever woman leader rise through a sea of mainly older men in parliament to take the helm. A patriarchal society and a political system that have long been dominated by men are now led by a woman. Now, you'll also have seen her standing side by side with President Trump as he called her a winner, amid cheers from US troops. These images are powerful, even if some women don't see her as an advocate for change. Remember, Japan has ushered in its first female PM, but in doing so, the country's politics have shifted further to the right. The former TV presenter, heavy metal drummer, and longtime fan of Margaret Thatcher has always wanted to be the Iron Lady of her country. And like Mrs. Thatcher, Sanai Takaichi is a staunch conservative. Her leadership seems to be a tactical move from the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, to claw back some of its conservative base from more right-wing parties like Sanseito. Ms. Takaichi opposes same-sex marriage and has long voted against legislation that would allow married couples to have separate surnames, preventing many women from keeping their maiden names. She's also against women being in line for succession in the imperial family. And yet, you can't argue that in the last 2 weeks, Sanai Takaichi has changed the game. Barely a week into office, the new prime minister faced a high-stakes visit from Donald Trump. Tokyo is heavily reliant on exports and can't afford a tariff fight, especially when it comes to its car industry. Although a deal was struck back in July by Takaichi's predecessor, which saw a reduction in tariffs from 25 to 15%, and Tokyo pledging to invest $550 billion in American industries, the details still need ironing out. And Tokyo has pledged to hike its defense spending too. Its security alliance with Washington is central in the face of a more assertive China, and as North Korea beefs up its nuclear program. Takaichi herself is known as a China hawk. It was very telling that after she was elected by parliament as leader, Beijing's response was muted. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiagon said the ministry had noted the election results, adding that it's Japan's internal affair. China and Japan are close neighbors, he went on, adding that the ministry hopes that Japan would honor its political commitments on major historical and Taiwan issues. China claims to self-govern Taiwan as its territory and has not ruled out using force to take control of it. Takaichi had called Taiwan an extremely important partner and cherished friend when she visited the island earlier this year. Now, she has to balance Tokyo's long-standing defense alliance with Washington and its crucial trade relationship with Beijing. It was clear that Takaichi and her team knew what made Donald Trump tick. His audience with Emperor Naruhito would have set the right mood. The next morning, a full military guard of honor and band welcomed Mr. Trump to the ornate Akasaka Palace, tailor-made for a president who relishes pomp and ceremony. Over lunch, Trump congratulated Takaichi on becoming Japan's first female prime minister. Notably, according to a White House readout, the lunch was American rice and American beef, deliciously made with Japanese ingredients, a move that will have delighted the president who has long demanded that Japan buy more U.S. rice. Some on social media weren't impressed, describing the reception and praise as over the top, verging on groveling. For his part, President Trump heaped praise on Ms. Takaichi, telling her that she would be one of the great prime ministers and that the U.S. would be there for anything you want, any favors you need, anything to help Japan. Remember, the two leaders have an influential friend in common. Sanai Takaichi is the protege of the late PM Shinzo Abe, who famously forged a close rapport with Donald Trump over golf. Cue the golf-themed gift from Japan's new leader to Mr. Trump, a golf bag signed by Japanese golf superstar Hideki Matsuyama, as well as a putter once owned by Shinzo Abe himself. Trump and Takaichi signed a document heralding a new golden age of U.S.-Japan relations, as well as a deal on rare earth minerals. For now, the tone is friendly, but there is real pressure on Tokyo to deliver on trade. Mr. Trump wants more U.S. access to Japan's markets and is pressing Tokyo to open up to American-made cars. It's a tough balancing act for Sanai Takaichi, who needs to protect Japan's domestic markets, keep Donald Trump on side, and hold her own at home and on the world stage.
Shaima Khalil.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next to Ireland, which for a long time has been known for its more stable centrist politics, avoiding the polarisation seen in the US and parts of Europe. But last weekend's presidential election suggests this is now changing. The winner, Catherine Connolly, presented herself as an anti-establishment candidate, and her victory marked a notable shift to the left. But the vote also revealed a record number of spoiled ballots, reflecting the rising anti-immigrant sentiment in Ireland and growing disaffection with the political class. Chris Page followed the election from Dublin.
An avowedly anti-establishment politician has won the most prestigious office in Ireland. Catherine Connolly's massive victory was declared in a setting of sumptuous splendour. Supporters from 5 left-wing parties, including Sinn Féin, Labour and the Greens, waited to greet her under a crystal chandelier in St Patrick's Hall in Dublin Castle. Until just over a century ago, this was London's headquarters on this island. The paintings on the ceiling feature 2 British monarchs. But it was the 10th President of the Republic who was congratulated, hugged and tearfully cheered as she arrived on the blue carpet for the formal announcement of the result. This was an election which broke records in Ireland. President-elect Connolly received more votes and a higher vote share than any of her predecessors. While the role is limited in its powers, it's influential in its symbolism, particularly abroad. Behind the lectern, in her softly spoken style, Ms Connolly said she would use her voice. A public and a democracy need constructive questioning, she said. It's a signal that she'll follow the precedent set by the outgoing President, Michael D. Higgins. He stretched the constitutional boundary that the President shouldn't criticise ministers, often by making pointed public pronouncements at odds with government policy. The parties in the centre-right coalition, which retained power in the general election here last year, have claimed President Connolly could alienate foreign allies. They pointed to her criticisms of the US, the UK and the EU, whom she linked to what she called the military-industrial complex. She told a University Politics Society that Germany was boosting its economy by increasing spending on arms. And, she added, there are some parallels with the 1930s. Opponents said she'd likened defence spending to Nazi rearmament. Ms Connolly responded that she was concerned about the normalisation of war. Opinion polls suggested she'd gained much support amongst younger voters because of her criticism of Israel's actions in the Middle East. Her rival was Heather Humphreys from the centre-right government party Fine Gael, which Ms Connolly attacked for its domestic policies, particularly a housing shortage which has left hundreds of thousands locked out of the market. A sense of being left behind and not sharing in economic growth has contributed to a sentiment which came unmistakably to the fore in this election. Officials and campaigners began to go over the ballot papers straight after they swished out of emptied boxes and onto tables at count centres. I was at the biggest one in Dublin. Within 15 minutes, the observers had drawn 2 conclusions. Firstly, they said, it's all over. Catherine Connolly's won by a landslide. But also, they'd never seen anywhere near as many spoiled ballots before. As the morning continued, their demeanour became steadily more bewildered. Quite a number of the vote-spoiling voters had written messages on their papers. A common example was, Number 1 Maria Steen, a reference to a potential candidate with socially conservative views who hadn't made it through the nomination process. One paper I saw had been covered by about 20 stickers with her picture. The single issue which was most mentioned was immigration. Slogans such as Ireland for the Irish appeared frequently. Some people wrote racial slurs. The tally chart from a polling station in southwest Dublin showed spoiled votes, in inverted commas, running ahead of Fine Gael's Heather Humphreys. Here, lots of people had written, she was 10. That was a reference to the victim of an alleged sexual assault in the area in the week before the election. The day after it was reported to have happened, there was a riot outside a hotel which is used to accommodate asylum seekers. Police wearing body armour and carrying shields stood by its gate to try to protect the building from a crowd of protesters. Bottles and bricks were thrown, and rioters tried to ride horses and motorbikes through the police line. Noticeable alongside the racket of crackling fireworks and abusive yells were non-Irish accents. Online right-wing activists who'd flown in from England that afternoon, they said, to show solidarity with the Dublin demonstrators. The comments on the live streams often featured the hashtag #SpoilYourVote. The 13% of ballots which were eventually defaced in this way didn't convey a coherent position, but it underlined that a notable number of people feel disengaged and disaffected with politics. Internationally, the Republic of Ireland has been characterised as electorally centrist and democratically stable. President Catherine Connolly said she would represent all, including those who didn't vote for her. Her pledge to be a first citizen for everyone could be challenging to fulfil amidst the signs of polarisation, which Ireland has up to this point largely avoided.
Chris Page. And finally, the annual olive harvest is a major cultural event for Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. But farmers there have come under increased attack by Jewish settlers this year. Olives are the backbone of agriculture in the region, providing tens of thousands of jobs. But the instability is making it harder for farmers to make ends meet. Tom Bennett reports from the occupied West Bank.
It's our blood, Othman Oda tells me. It's our life. We're standing in a grove of olive trees on a dusty hillside in the occupied West Bank. It's a tough landscape, blazing, uninterrupted sun through the summer months and short, wet winters. The hills all around us are rocky and barren, but the olive trees offer some respite, patches of sandy green peppered across the valley. In October each year, Palestinians far and wide gather for the olive harvest. It's our tradition, Othman tells me, pointing around his grove. Here there are men and women, young and old, clustered under trees going diligently about their work. It's a slow job. First, a sheet of tarpaulin is laid beneath the tree. Harvesters gather and shake the branches vigorously with their hands. Some use a specialised tool with rotating blunt blades. There's a gentle pitter-patter as the olives, ripened by the sun, land on the sheet. They're firm and a light green or wine black when they're first picked. They're then tipped into buckets, and after a few hours of harvesting, families will take them to a nearby olive oil factory, where machines sift, wash, grind and press them into a thick golden oil. Most years I'd make 50 gallons, Othman tells me. Each gallon would sell for around 500 shekels, he says, so his total crop should bring in roughly £5,000. It would support me for 6 months, he says. But the olive harvest is much more than a livelihood. Olive trees can be decades, centuries or even millennia old, passed down through families from generation to generation. Some people claim that one tree near Bethlehem is around 5,000 years old, older than Christianity, Islam or Judaism. For Palestinians, the olive harvest is a living symbol of their connection to their land. And it's for that reason, they say, that it's been under attack. Here last week in the village of Termessiah, Jewish settlers led a bloody attack against Palestinian harvesters, hurling stones and torching cars. In a video shared by American journalist Jasper Nathaniel, a 53-year-old Palestinian mother of 5, Afaf Abu Alia, is seen being clubbed over the head by a settler in an entirely unprovoked assault. She was hospitalised for several days. The attacker, masked, young and muscular, has not been identified. An Israeli police commander promised to find and arrest them. But to date, no arrests have been made, and locals say that's no surprise. The vast majority of attacks by Jewish settlers go unpunished. Just 3% of official investigations into settler violence between 2005 and 2023 ended in a conviction, according to Israeli civil rights group Yesh Din. Many incidents are not even investigated. Other assaults this year have seen settlers burn down groves, chainsaw olive trees and destroy Palestinian homes. The Israeli military told the BBC that it condemns all violence by settlers and is operated to ensure the olive harvest proceeds in a safe manner. But they are accused of doing almost nothing to stop the attacks, and have often been present during settler attacks and not intervened to protect Palestinian civilians. Monitoring groups say the aim of the attacks, which have increased again this year, is to intimidate Palestinians and eventually drive them from their land so settlers can seize it. Many settlers believe in a historical right to the West Bank, land they consider to be promised eternally to the Jewish people in the Bible. Under international law, the West Bank is Palestinian territory occupied by Israel, and Israeli settlements are illegal. As a breeze drifts through the valley, Othman points to a concrete hut on the opposite hillside. That, he says, is an outpost, where a settler lives just a few hundred metres from Othman's groves. As we are talking, an Israeli military truck emerges and begins driving up the winding track towards us, kicking up plumes of dust. It pulls over nearby. 3 young Israeli soldiers get out. This is a closed military zone, one says, until 11 a.m. tomorrow. You must leave, he adds, addressing all of us, saying it's due to the recent violence in the area. They are not rude or aggressive, just very matter of fact. Othman and his fellow farmers ask a few questions, but they accept the order. This, they say, is daily life, and they are used to being moved on. They pack up their equipment, heaping the olives they've managed to harvest in a few short morning hours into buckets, and drive off into the hills. The olive trees sway gently in the wind.
Tom Bennett, And that's all for today, but you can hear more dispatches from around the world on BBC Sounds, including a rare report from inside the ongoing conflict in Sudan. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Our culture can cancel someone in the blink of an eye. Celebrities, sports stars, politicians, influencers, and royalty can all find themselves in the firing line. In the age of AI-generated evidence, lawsuits written in legalese you need to pass the bar to decipher, how are you supposed to separate the fact from the fiction? That's where we come in. I'm Anushka Matanda-Dowty, and this is Fame Under Fire from BBC Sounds. We'll myth-bust, debunk, pre-bunk, fact-check, and get to the truth behind the timeline. There are new episodes every week, so make sure you listen to Fame Under Fire and subscribe on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.